Hey guys, Mr. Rayola here to tell you a little bit about the history of Latin America. If you look at the timeline in front of you, you'll notice that I've divided it into three sections. The first of which is the Pre-Columbian period. That's a period of history before Columbus arrives, and that's why we call it the Pre-Columbian period. It's also known as the Golden Age of Latin America, and it's a time period where Latin America is really, really successful, hence the name Golden Age. Um, After that, in 1492, Europeans start coming after Columbus discovers Latin America, and they start taking away the natural resources and colonizing that place. That's why we call this period the European colonization period. It's not a very happy time if you're a Latin American person, and it lasts a couple hundred years. Just after that, we have what we call the independence era, and that's basically when Latin Americans get fed up with Europeans coming and taking away their stuff just for a profit. Um, Latin Americans do everything they can to get Europeans out, and that's why we call it the independence era. But today we're really going to focus on the pre-Columbian period, or that golden age. So as we take a closer look, there's really a lot of cultures in the pre-Columbian period, but there's four I really want to focus on because I think they're the best examples of Latin American success during this time period. The first of which would be the Olmec civilization. Now, it says here that they're one of the earliest Latin American civilizations, and that's definitely true, but don't get me wrong, they're not the first people to live in Latin America. They're really just the first organized people to live in Latin America. The Olmec people end up having government, organized religion, and a strong economy, and that's not something people before had. So around 1500 BCE, the Olmec people come around, and what makes them kind of cool is that they're really great at math. They're actually one of the first people to ever use the number zero, and at first glance, that doesn't really sound like an impressive thing, but that's because we really use zero all the time today. You can really thank the Olmec people for that. Second, if you take a look at the picture on your screen, you'll notice a giant stone head. This is really typical of the Olmec people. They carved lots of these, and they're enormous. They're bigger than people. A person standing next to this might come up to about the eyeball or the nose. So you can see it's about twice the height of a person. Never mind, it's thousands and thousands of pounds because it's made out of solid rock. What's really amazing about these is how they move them. Really, historians aren't sure, but we do know they didn't have domesticated animals, so they couldn't use something like an oxen to move these things. Instead, they probably had to use pure manpower. Considering the weight of this, that's a pretty impressive fact. The Olmecs weren't the only successful people during this period, though. You also have the Mayans, who are really, really famous actually today in popular culture. In the picture on your screen, you'll notice the Mayan calendar, which some of you may have heard of before. According to the Mayans and some people today, they actually predicted the end of the world. And I hate to break it to you, they predicted it December 21st, 2012. And guess what? That means no Christmas presents this year. But I guess that also means no homework, so you luck out there. But one of the reasons we take the Mayans so seriously with this calendar is because it's so accurate before us. It works a little bit different than what our calendar does, but basically if you look, you'll notice smaller and smaller rings as you go towards the center. Those basically represent years, months, weeks, and days. You also have pictographic symbols instead of numbers. But what makes this really impressive is it's really accurate. The Mayans were really good astronomers, and they studied the stars, and they could actually use this to predict lunar eclipses, something that not many cultures could do. They're also great mathematicians because they come up with a really sophisticated system of numbers. They don't use the number system we use today, but they use like dots and lines. It's kind of similar to Roman numerals, except there's a couple different rules. But it's a very original way to do math. Both the Mayans and the Olmecs and the next people we're going to look at lived in Central America, what is today Mexico and Guatemala. The Aztec people are somebody you may have heard of. I know them, and most people know them best because they performed human sacrifices. This is something that a lot of people like to focus on. The Aztec people, yes, they actually killed people for their gods. The reason they did this is to prove how devoted they were to their gods. They were really afraid of their gods. They felt that their gods would punish them if they didn't show how devoted they were. How would they punish them? Maybe they wouldn't let it rain, so there'd be a drought or a natural disaster such as a flood, or maybe the sun wouldn't even come up. The Aztec people were really concerned with their gods and making them happy. That way they could survive. So one of the things they built, and a piece of evidence to show what great engineers they were these things called step pyramids, as you can see on your screen. These are kind of similar to the ones you might see in Egypt, except they're slightly different. What they do have in common is their relative shape, okay, and size. They're massive. But step pyramids have layers, okay, that slowly get smaller as you go up, and that's why they kind of resemble steps, and we call them step pyramids. Their purpose is also very different. Egyptian pyramids were built solely as grave markers. They were gravestones for really important pharaohs. The Aztec people used their pyramids differently. They weren't gravestones. Instead, they were places to put temples on top of. They were religious buildings. You can see the temple on top of this one right here. And they built them so high is because they wanted to get closer to the gods. They figured the higher they were, the closer they were to the gods. And gods usually live in the sky, so it made sense to them. One of the other things that's really impressive about the Aztecs is their ability to build in impossible places. They actually built their capital city in the middle of a lake. They had to build things like floating gardens to grow their agriculture. These are literally gardens that floated in lakes in order to let them survive. Speaking of somebody that built in impossible places, how about the Incas? The Incas were really impressive. They built their civilization on tops of the Andes Mountains. That's in Peru and Chile today. And the Andes, if you don't know, are some of the world's biggest mountains. You can see a picture here of the most famous site today. This is Machu Picchu, one of their more important cities. And you can see there's even clouds up here. Why did they do this? Mainly for defense. But what this proves is that they were really good builders. They built in impossible places. This wasn't easy to do. Another thing that made the Incas really cool and showed how intelligent they created this system of writing that didn't use paper or stone. They actually used string with knots in it. The size of the knots, the placement of the knots, and the number of the knots actually meant words and numbers. And they could use this to communicate with each other. Now, they spoke, obviously, but when they were trading, they needed a way to write, to keep track of what they traded, what they bought, what they sold, and how much they still owned, kind of like a receipt today. So they used this system, which they called quipus, with the knots, to keep track of this. What made it even better is that it was really good at being portable. You could move it from place to place because it was light, not like a stone. This just goes to show you how smart the Incas really were. So these are the four groups I really want you to understand in the Pre-Columbian period, or the Golden Age, because they're really the best examples of how successful Latin America used to be. Later we'll talk about the European colonization period, where Europeans come and basically destroy this. All right, look forward to seeing you soon.